That's good. At least I haven't forgotten. And I'd love to introduce you to you tonight, Dr. Hannah Belcher, who has written the book that we have a giveaway and that you can't see properly because of my blurred screen, but it's called Taking Off the Mask. And I'm sure that Hannah will tell you a little bit about it when she does her presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Hannah to introduce herself and then go through her presentation. Afterwards, we will take questions. So if you would like to ask a question, feel free to put it in the chat, but it will be really, really helpful if you could just preface it with the word question in capitals. That will help us to find the questions out from all of the chat, because there are quite a lot of you on here tonight and we might get a lot of questions. I hope that we'll be able to answer them all, but it's possible that we won't be able to, but we'll do our very best. So handing over to Hannah now.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much as well for having me come and speak to you about a topic that's really close to my heart, as well as I know being quite a popular topic at the moment. So I'm going to be talking about masking in autistic girls and the kind of effects that can have on mental health and diagnosis, and then following that, what we can actually do to best support girls that are going through those issues. So just a little bit about myself first. We go, my story. I don't think my story is a particularly uncommon story for autistic girls at all. At the time, it was very difficult and challenging for me, but actually the more I spoke to autistic people and parents, it became quite apparent that actually this is the kind of common trajectory for a lot of autistic girls. So I wasn't diagnosed as a child, and I dropped out of school when I was 14. The reason for that was kind of unknown at the time. I had a lot of physical kind of problems, illnesses, menstrual problems. But looking back on it, I think the biggest issue was that school had become too big, that the social kind of world became too pressurized. And I gradually started going less and less before I just couldn't go at all. So it took about a year for the school to notice that I wasn't at school. And then from then on managed to get some kind of home tuition through the kind of government education council kind of thing. But I would say nothing to like write home about, so I had to teach myself a lot of the stuff. From that, I developed quite severe agoraphobia, so I wasn't able to leave the house, and anxiety and depression as well. And so my world became really quite small. I was given a cocktail of medication. So I think before I even was depressed, it was always treated as, you know, this must be some kind of anxiety or depression, rather than looking at actually what the issues were. So my GP gave me antidepressants when I was quite young. I finally received therapy, but it wasn't for several years after having a lot of quite severe mental health problems. So after school, I did go to college to do A-levels, but again, I think my attendance was about 20% at the time. And I really struggled with that. And then I went on to university. I don't know what I was thinking. I just suddenly decided, I've always been quite adamant about wanting to get a PhD and wanting to kind of progress in academia, because that was where I felt my talents kind of lied. So I did go to university, but again, I was severely agoraphobic the whole time that I was there. My housemates would have to go out and get me food, and I never went to any lectures at all. So a lot of what I did was self-taught. Once I'd finished university and finally come out, I was finally actually referred to a community mental health team and actually got therapy for the first time throughout all of that. So that took about 10 years in total. Multiple mental health crises. So I still go through these quite regularly, where I'd be okay for a few months and then everything would kind of come crashing down and the anxiety and depression would get really severe. I was labelled many things. So avoidant was one thing. A CBT therapist told me I was avoidant because I couldn't label my emotions in the therapy, when actually I just didn't know what my feelings were. Borderline personality. I wasn't diagnosed with this, but it was kind of floated around that it was kind of borderline traits because of all the mental health difficulties I was having. And then finally, an art therapist kind of pointed out that a lot of the difficulties I was having seemed quite similar to those of other people, autistic girls she knew. And that's when I went for my diagnosis, and I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. So now that's just an autism spectrum condition because we don't use that term anymore, but that was around the age of 23. So I'm 33 now. I went on to do my PhD in undiagnosed autistic women and misdiagnosed autistic women as well, mainly because I, through my diagnosis, met so many other women like myself, and there was so much anecdotal evidence about why autistic girls were being missed, masking, camouflaging, but there was no actual scientific academic research. It took me so long to do my PhD, I think it took about 7 years in total, that quite a lot has come out since then. So this last decade has seen loads of new research come out about autistic girls, but that's still not quite connecting with the clinicians, and it's still not quite connecting with the schools sometimes either. I think that might take us a little bit more time. So what I do now is I lecture in user-led research at King's College University, and that basically means that I'm involved in research where we use people with lived experience to kind of co-lead the research. So a lot of the research I do on mental health and autism has a team of other autistic people or people with lived experience with mental health problems to help us with that research. And the benefit of that is, you know, you get so much more insight than when you're just doing studies on populations that you don't have that kind of contact with. So what we know so far, autistic girls are diagnosed later than boys. So there's quite a bit of research on this now. My own study found this. I found that the females were diagnosed later than males. Only 1/5 of girls were diagnosed before the age of 11, according to a report that the National Autism Society brought out, which is quite a damning kind of statistic. And other studies like this one found that 58% of females didn't receive a diagnosis until after the age of 18. So adult diagnoses for women is really common. And the point we want to get to is where the age is getting kind of less and less and matching up with kind of when a boy would be diagnosed, for example. So there's several different reasons for this. The first of these is just a general clinician bias. So how autism has been understood has been through typically a male lens. So when we think about when autism was first kind of conceptualized as a condition, it was based on the majority of boys. So if we look at Kanner and Asperger, who were the first kind of Austrian physicians that first identified these kind of populations, most, if not all of the population they were basing their ideas on were boys. And then from that leads this kind of dialogue that this is the presentation of autism. So then all the screening tools are based on autistic boys, and then all the assessments are based on autistic boys. And the theories coming out, such as the extreme male brain theory that said that autism was an extreme version of the male brain, was again based on boys. So what we saw really was this massive lack in the research of any autistic girls or how they presented, or even not just autistic girls and boys, but there's just this distinct lack of any other gender. Non-binary is really common for autistic people, trans is really common for autistic people, and all of that dialogue is missing when we look at the history of autism. So that's why clinicians still tend to be biased because of the tools. The other thing to note is autistic girls do seem to present with less external behavioural traits. So one study found that autistic girls needed to present more challenging behaviours than the boys to actually get a diagnosis. And there is statistics that show that the gender ratio of boys to girls who are autistic is much less when you look at populations that also have intellectual disability. So the kind of, I guess, the wider the spectrum you go, where you get individuals that don't have intellectual disabilities that would have been considered previously as high functioning, although we don't use that term anymore, but that's what they would have been diagnosed with. The gender disparity then becomes much greater. And what we know, therefore, is that when you include girls that don't have intellectual disabilities, that don't have challenging behaviours, that gender disparity is much less. And also, if you include those that are potentially in the general population that haven't even been assessed yet, the gender disparity gets smaller and smaller. That's not to say that autistic boys aren't more likely to be autistic than autistic girls. We don't know that yet for sure, but we do know that the ratio is much lower than what we thought it was. And then the other common thing is masking, and that's mainly what my talk's going to be about. And I'm going to go through what masking really is, why it happens, why girls are more prone to it, and then also the effects that can have on mental health. So firstly, what is masking? So there's several different ideas around masking. It was originally called camouflaging, and the idea of this is trying to hide autistic traits to appear like normal. So non-autistic is the phrase used. So that could be things like suppressing stims in public. A lot of autistic people might do things with their hands, flapping with their hands, making different movements, repetitive movements. Those are suppressed often if someone is masking. Forcing themselves to make eye contact, for example. That's something that I definitely learned when I was growing up, was that I needed to count out my eye contact, so that would appear non-autistic and I'd appear kind of as I should be to other people. Monitoring voice intonation. This came to me quite late in life. I'm quite a monotone person, but I started realizing that actually, you know, I was looking at other people and how they put that kind of voice, that intonation into their voice, and how that can hide autistic traits as well. And also things like hiding special interests. So, you know, when we think of, if you ask someone that doesn't know much about autism or historically about autism, things like fascinations with numbers and trains. If you look at any of the assessment criteria, they ask things like, do you have a fascination of numbers? We don't tend to see that in an autistic person that's masking. Their interests are much more considered kind of non-autistic and typical. So things like being obsessed with certain celebrities that their peers might be, or certain toys that are really popular at the moment. So all those kind of special interests kind of go underneath the radar, but it's really the intensity of that interest rather than what the interest is itself. And then there's also the idea of compensating for autistic traits. So things like compensating for having difficulties with social communication. So an autistic person might mimic others in social situations. They might mimic others from TV programs, from books, for example. I've always had this, and the reason I went into psychology was because I had such a fascination of humans. And to me, it was like watching humans, like you watch those animal programs, like how they interact with each other, how they talk to each other, what kind of responses they make to each other. And that kind of mimicking means that in real life, I'm able to put that into a context that means that I can hide that difficulty that I have with social communication. And things like learning social rules and social scripts as well. A lot of autistic girls do from a very young age. And rehearsing social situations too. So this is really common. A lot of autistic girls, or autistic people in general, find themselves running through in their heads narratives of what's happening, what they're going to say, even in front of a mirror sometimes, as if they're talking to that person. And then also the other aspect of masking is this wanting need to fit in with others. So the reason we mask is because we want to appear atypical, we want to appear what others consider normal, in brackets, and we want to be seen as non-autistic in a sense. So that could be things like feeling like you have to put an effort into being around people or others, or that you need to perform. And sometimes that can be the first sign that something isn't right. The fact that you're having to put that effort in, it feels like a performance and you don't feel like you're yourself, it can kind of indicate that actually something else is going on. And that is really common as well for non-autistic people. All these things you might be looking at thinking, well, I do that and I'm not autistic. And it's true, all non-autistic people learn to copy other humans. They learn how to fit in. The difference is the differences in the cultures between those two kind of, and the jumps made. So for non-autistic people, the effort made to do this is much less. It often doesn't really go past adolescence when people start really finding their own identities, for example. And also they're learning the same culture as themselves. So they're learning the same non-autistic traits to kind of fit in. Whereas if you're making the jump as being an autistic person to trying to fit in with the non-autistic culture, it's like a completely different society. It's a completely different set of rules, norms, and everything. And what we find is as well, masking lasts throughout the lifetime. So an autistic person has to mask throughout their lives. It doesn't really get easier. The intensity of it is much greater. So having to mask all the time, not really having downtime from that masking. The idea of having a backstage isn't really there for autistic people, as it is for non-autistic people. So although the concepts behind masking might be similar, and when we look at assessments for masking, non-autistic people also score on the scale, it's a continuum. We see autistic people score much higher and in much more kind of intense forms. So as I said, autistic people report using masking strategies much more than non-autistic people do. And this has come about from the development of a scale that can assess camouflaging traits, masking traits in autistic people. At the moment, there is an adult version of this. It's called the CAT-Q. You can find it, actually, there's a copy of that in my book as well, which I'll bring you on to at the end, that you can take yourself. But there's also a children's version of it that a parent can take as well to see how much their child is actually masking to, which can be really helpful just to identify areas where they might be putting a lot of energy in. So why do autistic people mask more? Part of this is the huge stigma that is faced and the bullying that many of us have to face throughout our lives because of our behavioural differences, because of how we're perceived as being not the typical kind of presentation of behaviour. There's been quite a few studies in the last year or two around the first impressions that autistic people make to non-autistic people. And it makes quite sad reading because what we find is that even when non-autistic people aren't aware that they're viewing autistic people, they still rate them less favourably than they do when they look at the behaviour, the social behaviours of non-autistic people. And one of the things I looked at was gender differences in that. And there does seem to be a protective factor for females in that autistic girls are rated slightly more favourably than autistic boys, but still not as great as non-autistic people do. So it goes without saying that even if an autistic person hasn't necessarily faced that bullying or that really overt stigma, there's just a general bias amongst people about how they kind of make those judgments and impressions around us and our behaviours. So masking becomes a way of keeping us safe and a kind of an obligation rather than a choice. So I think what we've been trying to move away from is this idea that autistic people are purposely masking to deceive others. You know, it's like an act. It actually often starts unconsciously, and it starts unconsciously from the moment we become socially aware. And often we don't become conscious of that strategy that we're using until well into kind of adolescence, adulthood. And it's becoming more and more apparent. I think older adults are becoming more aware of it who are autistic because there's so much narrative now around it. But it doesn't start as a conscious thing. It doesn't start as something that we choose to do. It's there to keep us safe and to protect us from other people, basically. So that's this idea of there being, and I said this earlier, this kind of neurotypical social culture and how different that is for autistic people and how much more effort they have to put in over a longer period of time and in more situations to mask their autistic traits and to fit in. So there is this mixed mash between one's natural state of being and what is actually expected socially. And another term that this has been coined is a double empathy problem. So there's this idea that often people historically thought autistic people don't have empathy or they have problems with empathy. But what we're now learning is that actually it's not that they don't have empathy, it's that actually non-autistic people also fail to have empathy for autistic people. They're like two different social cultures. And if you see two autistic people discussing together or making friendships, you'll see that there's lots of empathy there. The issue tends to be in jumping that barrier between the two, autistic and non-autistic. And for too long, there's had this negative framework on it's autistic people that are the problem, we lack empathy, and we can't fit in with this culture, we need to change them. And then this goes on to this other idea that often autistic people are given treatments or they're socialized in a way that encourages masking and it encourages the adopting of more neurotypical social behaviors. That's how things have been going for so long for autistic people, is that they've been taught how to fit in. And that kind of feeds into this narrative of you need to master your autistic traits to fit in because you're the problem. And that's what we're trying to tackle now, is that idea that actually there's other ways to deal with these differences and it's not all on the onus on the autistic person to do that. So girls might be more likely to mask. Why is that? Firstly, gender socialization, and this is a biggie. So girls are often taught in society a certain set of gendered rules, if you like. So things like behaving well, considering others, be empathic, talking softly or quietly, learning to share and how to play with other children. Whereas what we see with boys is they're taught much more to be independent, to be leaders, to be strong. There's less emphasis on this getting on with others and more on actually being strong, independent people. And if you think about the kind of typical traits of autism, it really clashes with the idea of what society expects a female to be like. And so there seems to be a greater pressure on girls to actually hide their autistic traits. And one of the other ways we know this is happening is because when we look at parent assessment, so in studies where they've looked at observational kind of methods of how a child is behaving, they're very similar to autistic boys. However, if you were then asked the parents and give the parents a measure of their behavior, the parents of autistic girls will often say their autistic girls have much more social communication problems, have much more challenging behavior, even though they don't at all. It's just the expectations are much higher for those girls. So that kind of feeds in to why autistic girls are masking more, because they're taught that that's the right thing to do. And also other research is beginning to show that girls might have different mental abilities, which mean that they find it easier to mask. So there's some advantages there, and we call these executive functions, so ways our brain kind of works to operate. So mental abilities like memory, really important for learning social scripts and being able to then apply if you've learned a social script to a different situation. So if they've seen two children in the playground, for example, having a conversation, to then be able to remember how that looked and how those two children acted, to then be able to put it into action themselves when they're next having a conversation, for example. Pre-planning, so that kind of thing about learning social scripts, looking ahead, knowing what's coming so you know how to act. If you know you've got an event coming up or a birthday party, pre-planning that so you know what kind of mask, what kind of things you're going to do to hide your autism. And also impulse control, because suppressing stims and things like that takes a lot of impulse control, because often these are things that occur naturally to us to do if we're anxious or if we're self-soothing, for example. So it's been shown that girls have a much bigger advantage in these areas, and even some areas of the brain have been shown to be stronger for girls. What we don't know is what causes what. So we don't know if it's the fact that because girls are socialized more to be like this, that means their brains have developed in a way that takes advantage of these kind of mental abilities, or whether it's the fact that they are born with these better mental abilities and that then feeds into being able to mask. It's likely a combination of lots of different things. But yeah, these are some of the reasons why we might mask more. And then the how as well. So studies have shown that girls tend to join in more shared games and they follow other girls. When they look at playgrounds and they look at how children are interacting, one study found that the boys tended to spend much more time in solitary play, whereas the girls did this thing that they kind of called hovering. So they'd always be hovering on the outside of a group, and they'd hover between groups. So it always looked like they were fitting in, but actually what they were doing was kind of hiding themselves in a way and kind of camouflaging themselves in a way. So it wasn't that they were necessarily part of that friendship group and, they were enjoying the game. It was just they were kind of learning how to fit in with the rest of the girls that were kind of around them. They seem to have less repetitive and restrictive behaviours. All these are more suppressed. So as I said about the interests, it's not that there might be less of them, it's just that they're different and they appear more typical. And less repetitive behaviours and restrictive things. And these are all kind of observational signs that someone might be autistic. And if these are hidden, it means that girls are less likely to be picked up, because all these behaviours that we consider challenging or obvious aren't being seen. And as I said, more typical special interests like celebrities or things their peers like, and also some better emotional and social functioning too. So on a study that I did that looked at the differences between non-autistic or undiagnosed, potentially undiagnosed autistic women and diagnosed autistic women, the differences were that those that didn't have the diagnosis seemed to have more empathy and better social functioning. But again, we don't know why for sure, and we don't know what causes what, whether it's the fact that being forced into more gender socialization or being forced to play with friends, for example, that leads to better empathy because they're around children more, they're around others their age more, so they learn empathy more. And that also feeds into better social functioning too. So for me, I was always a bit of a hoverer as a child. So I always had friendship groups, but I was very quiet. I was mute as a child. And I think looking back, it was very obvious that I was autistic, but actually if you'd see me in those playgrounds and in those groups, I was always kind of hovering on the edge of those groups, and I was suppressing everything. So I was suppressing even talking because I didn't want to bring attention to myself and say the wrong thing. So often we see girls that are just very quiet, they get misdiagnosed with just social anxiety, or they're just shy. And those sort of things can mean that they fly under the radar for a really long time at school before anything's done about it. So how does it affect mental health? And I think it's kind of obvious in a way how and why that would affect mental health. So this is a kind of diagram that I drew about myself, but I think it applies to a lot of people. So there's this idea that I want people to like me and I want to fit in. And to do that, I have to do what they expect of me. And I do that by masking, because then I hide my autistic traits and I'm fitting in with what they want. But because I'm masking so much, I can't look after and meet my own needs too. And that leads to going into a crisis and burning out. And then you end up withdrawing from others, and the whole cycle repeats itself, because when you withdraw from others, you then become different, and you then start not fitting in with people again. So we know that masking is positively correlated with increased depression and anxiety. We know that it is linked to suicidality as well. And we know that girls are at greater risk because firstly, they're at greater risk of mental health problems anyway, and they're also at increased risk of heightened masking. So if you add those two things together, this is a little bit of a danger zone for autistic girls, and something that we want to stop fairly early on before it develops into more severe mental health difficulties, basically. So why is it so challenging? What is causing the mental health difficulties for autistic girls that are masking? So one of the things is that it is absolutely exhausting if you think about the amount of self-monitoring and how much autistic girls have to adapt in different social situations with different people all day with no backstage, no time off, is just purely exhausting. And it uses up those mental resources as well that can't be used elsewhere. So if you're having to constantly learn and memorize social scripts, you're having to inhibit natural behaviors and responses, you're pre-planning constantly what's coming, those other resources that you've got for things like doing your homework, or, you know, when you come home from school and you're absolutely tired and your mum's asking you, what did you do today? Just really simple things become too much because you're absolutely exhausted and you can't speak anymore and you're starting to shut down. So that is one of the main problems that comes about with masking and what leads to the eventual kind of burnout from that. And then the other side of it is that actually when you're masking your natural behaviors, it denies expression of your true self and your identity as well. So we often don't feel as autistic people that we belong, and that we're isolated because we have to mask. There's quite a strong connection between this idea of thwarted belonging and autistic people, and how that really sadly links to suicidality and self-harm as well. And these are all real danger zones for autistic people anyway. Autistic people are more likely to be victims of abuse, and they're more likely to have mental health problems, and really sadly they are more likely to take their own lives because of all these difficulties that they're facing. And one of these difficulties is masking. So as I said, thwarted belonging, it does increase suicidality in autistic people. It also means hiding or stopping special interests and those positive aspects of our identity. So if your child is having to pretend to be someone they're not, liking things that their friends like, they're not having the opportunity to actually enjoy their lives, to enjoy the things that they want to be doing. And that in itself takes a lot away and leads to depression. And then being encouraged by others to mask, it just reinforces that our true selves aren't acceptable or good enough. So as I said, you know, there are certain treatments and things that encourage this for autistic people, and what that encourages basically is telling us that our true selves aren't good enough, that we need to be different. And that sticks with people for their lives when they learn those things early on. And so I think why is reducing masking important is a kind of obvious answer. Masking increases mental health problems long term. So adults that mask as children have severe mental health difficulties when they're older. And if they aren't problem behaviours, they don't really need to be changed. So this is something that I'm quite a strong advocate for. I think a lot of the times people will look at autistic behaviours and think because they might be noisy, or they might be distracting, or they might look weird, that means that they need to be changed. But actually, if they're not causing a problem, they're not hurting the child, they're not hurting anyone around them, there is no need really to reduce those behaviours or to change them, because to do so is at the detriment of that person's mental health. As I said, it doesn't improve, as I said before, first impressions and things are quite poor of autistic people, but in the study that I did, it didn't actually improve the judgments that non-autistic people made. So when we looked at the camouflaging ratings, they didn't mean that if someone camouflaged more, they were liked more by the non-autistic people observing them. So actually masking might not even be doing the job that a lot of people think it's doing. It's not helping people fit in any more than if they weren't, for example. People still pick up on atypical behaviours and they still kind of notice those differences. What we do know, though, is that in those studies where they were looking at the judgments made of non-autistic people, when those non-autistic observers were told that the people they were judging were autistic, they rated them much more positively. And so that tells me, and hopefully other people and researchers too, that what we want to move away from is teaching autistic people to change their behaviours and fit in, and actually teaching non-autistic people that there is different ways that people present behaviourally, socially, and that they need to be accepting of those behaviours and to view them more positively. And so this brings me on to how to help your autistic girls and what kind of techniques can you use. The techniques that I've come up with are things that I've found helpful through my journey. They're also things that I've spoke to or got from other autistic people, parents of autistic people, teachers and therapists. And these are kind of what make up the majority of my book, in a way, is that kind of lived experience of what has helped other people. So what I always say is that some of these things might be really useful for your child, but others of them might be not, and that's okay. It's just finding out exactly what it is that's going to benefit your child, for example. So this one's slightly obvious, but again, worth pointing out. So avoid picking up on your child's behaviours as being wrong, particularly if they're not harming anyone. So if they find stimming helpful, for example, allowing them to do this and encouraging to do it, even if it's in public, because it's soothing and it helps calm them, is a good thing if it's not hurting anybody else around them. And this, I came up with this kind of scale of working out how much a behaviour was harming other people or the child, and how much of it was just being seen as embarrassing, and being able to really honestly look at that behavior and say, is the reason I'm trying to stop that because it's embarrassing me, or I'm worried that my child is going to get bullied because they're behaving in that way, or is it actually because it is harmful behavior? So this example, and there's a few more in my book, is around a child who makes loud humming noises when they're anxious. So actually this is not harmful behavior at all. The only way it could be harmful is if other people around them find the noise difficult to handle. But you might find that kind of behavior quite embarrassing, because people might be looking at you and thinking, not understanding that your child's autistic, or thinking it's your parenting. All these things are quite natural for parents to worry about, because you're protective of your child and you want the best for your child as well. So looking at how differently you could respond to that situation. So this one is thinking about, well, I'm maybe more embarrassed about this behavior than actually it's harming, and it's clearly helping the child to deal with sensory overload. So you don't want to stop it. Different ways of dealing with it could be to talk to people around them about why they're doing it, or hand out cards, for example, explaining what the behavior is. Or you could try explaining to your child that sometimes other people might get overloaded by the noise, and it might be better to do it somewhere quieter, or to move away from people when they're doing it. Or we could work on knowing when to start and stop as well, so that the child is aware that, you know, it's something they can do to help themselves, that, you know, having a bit more control over that. There's lots of different ways to go about it, but it's just a general idea of kind of helping the child find a good out for their natural behaviours. The other part of it is encouraging them to plan and process their worries and their social situations, and not forcing them, but just looking ahead. And what I mean by this is not looking ahead to mask. So not looking ahead and finding a social script that they can mask behind, but masking is usually the result of anxiety. And the more anxious someone gets, the more camouflage, the more masking they put on. And what we want to do is relieve some of that mask, relieve some of that need to camouflage. So by making situations a little bit more clear and a little bit more predictable, less masking might be needed in those situations. So, for example, you've been invited to a friend's birthday party or a family gathering, and it's important they don't miss those situations. They want to learn and enjoy those, but at the same time, it might just be too overwhelming for them. So you could suggest instead a different, smaller get-together, or have multiple, if they have multiple social situations in the week, or helping them choose the best one to attend. And the other thing I've kind of come up with the help of a therapist was this idea of having a social script. And what this means is having a very practical, written out document of what's happening, when it's happening, who's it with, and all the stages that need to go before it to get ready for that happening. So it could be things as basic as we're going to have breakfast, then we're going to do this, then we're going to have lunch, then we're going to leave, and where we're going to leave and who we're going to leave with. And then kind of planning out exactly what's going to happen when they get there too. So things like, who's going to greet them at the door when they knock on the door, where they're going to find the friend to give them the present, what they're going to do in between times, when is food going to be served, who's going to pick them up, who might they be chatting to. And these are all things as well that you might want to pre-plan with the parent whose house they're going to as well, just to help them kind of really fully understand where that anxiety might be lying. And hopefully with that, the child would be less anxious. They know exactly what's happening. The other thing to do is to try and encourage children to engage in hobbies and things that actually interest them. So what can sometimes happen is parents can become a little bit concerned that autistic people's focus is quite hyper-focused on a specific topic. And they might feel a bit worried that if that might look odd to others, if they see their child engaging in it, or they might worry that actually they need more broader interests and activities. But what's really important is those interests have much more importance to an autistic child than, say, a non-autistic child. And actually the time spent in having those special interests in those activities is a really important time for that child, and it's quite therapeutic as well. So instead it might be using those special interests, encouraging them to do things they're not comfortable with. So if they're going to an appointment, for example, taking a specific toy that they're really attached to, or if they've got home from school and they're very overwhelmed, you might say encourage them to actually physically pick up and do that special interest. And often as adults, we end up in jobs that are related to our special interests. Like I said, my special interest was always people, and ended up going into psychology and becoming a researcher because I was so fascinated by people and books and things like that. So I think it's important to hone in on those special interests and use them. And also because they're things your child like, they're part of their identity. And that means that boosts their morale and that boosts their kind of self-esteem and their kind of well-being as well. So again, I feel like, talk to parents, this is really teaching you to suck eggs here. I'm sure you all know this and do this, but to let your child regularly know that you like the person they are and to teach self-compassion. So your child probably feels a lot of shame. Shame is a really common emotion for autistic people. Social faux pas happen every day. We're constantly being put down or being laughed at in various ways. And it's important that they have safe people around them who they completely be themselves with and who they know love them for all their quirks and who wouldn't want to change that. And so simple compassion exercises. Again, there's lots more of these in the book. But simple meditative breathing exercise with your child when they're feeling overwhelmed to just bring that anxiety down. Getting them to draw a portrait of themselves and then to list around the drawing things they like about themselves. So you can give them some suggestions or even do one for yourself to show how that self-compassion works. Or asking them to write a letter to a friend or a family member that kind of shares how much they appreciate them. So they're practicing those compassionate ideas and that kind of self-esteem kind of building exercises. Yeah. And then the other thing is surrounding them with autistic role models and other autistic children as well. So most of our lives are spent with non-autistic people. We might be lucky in that we find another autistic person in our lives at some point. I didn't find my first autistic friend until I was, I think, 25, and now I have a few. Those friendships to me are much easier and are a lot deeper than my non-autistic friendships. Although I love my non-autistic friends greatly, I didn't really feel myself until I met another autistic person and we had that kind of bond. And it's that idea of normalcy, like when you're around people like you start feeling normal. So books like The Underdogs by Chris Bonello, who's autistic himself, are great because they show a different side to being autistic. They show a kind of positive side to being autistic. And also this book as well that was written at a school for autistic girls, and it was written by the actual children in the school too. And so reading about those different populations of people and just being around people more like yourself. There might be social groups near you where autistic children and parents get together. If there's not, you might be able to find some online. Or there might be autistic friendly events as well that are really useful to go to. I think it's just a great thing for an autistic child to start meeting other autistic children as early as possible. I think there's a danger sometimes that people often think, well, if they mix with autistic people, they're going to become more autistic. What you might find is they seem more autistic because they let their mask down. But that's a good thing, because that means that they're kind of decreasing their kind of mental health risks as well, and they're growing in their self-esteem. So practicing unmasking. This is something that I wrote more specifically for adults, because I think when it comes to children, it's slightly more risky. So I think when it comes to unmasking, it's more about creating a safe space. So home should hopefully feel safe. And then hopefully you want to branch that out so other family members' households feel safe, other children's households feel safe, and school feels safe. And gradually those environments just kind of expand out. And it's key not to enforce or push this. But you can do little experiments, little behavioural experiments around masking. So this was one example of that I had. So a friend had asked me to go to a concert, but I really didn't like the band and I felt I couldn't cope with the busy venue. And so it's thinking about with your child, what will happen? What do you think will happen? So their worst fear. So I feel like if I tell her, she's just going to feel let down, she's going to think I'm boring, and she won't ask me to do things again. So then you start thinking of ways that you can actually test that prediction. Is it going to come true or not? So in this example, I say I'm going to send a text explaining that I want to spend time with her, but I just can't make the concert at the weekend because it's really busy. You do the experiment and then you write down what actually happened. So in this experiment, it turned out fine. She texts back saying it was great and that we could do something a different time. And then you start to actually reflect on it with your child too. And actually, what does it mean? Your prediction and the kind of assumptions that you had about if you didn't mask and pretend to your friend didn't happen. And how can you set those boundaries in the future? And then gradually just kind of becoming more of an advocate around when you're masking, when you're not masking. So becoming more aware of it. I think that's a great thing for children to become aware of too, is to know when they're masking, when they're not masking, and then think of ways in different situations where maybe they don't have to mask as much as they thought they did. And then ideas for teachers and educators as well. So as I said, creating safe spaces at school. So for me, it would have been having a room I could have gone to on my own, having teachers that are aware, and just place to unwind. So there's a backstage to take down that mask if needed, and just reduce the overall stress levels and exhaustion of being at school all day, masking all day is a massive thing. I think listening to parents and guardians as well, because what we often see is autistic girls that are masking behave really well at school, really shy, quiet, and get on with their work. But actually when they get home, they might be having meltdowns, they might be presenting more challenging behaviours because they're so overwhelmed, and home is a safe space, they can let it out. And so we know that parents and guardians know their child best, and often schools ignore this. And so it's important that schools work together with the parent to actually bring about another safe environment for that child. Playing to their strengths and providing lots of praise. So as I said, many autistic children are full of self-criticism, and making sure they're just doing well and giving them the confidence to excel in the areas that they're doing well in, because often we have patterns of abilities as well as kind of disabilities and difficulties and differences, and it's so easy sometimes to just focus on those difficulties and trying to work on those. So this is my book. Some of the stuff I've spoke about is included in the book, but there's lots more in it as well. It's called Taking Off the Mask. As I said, there's lived experience and tips from other autistic people. There's advice from therapists. There's more exercises to help improve mental health and masking. And there is also a specific section for parents as well. So it might be that you find the book helpful to go through if you've got an adolescent, for example, or an older child. It might be that if you've got a younger child, you find the chapter for parents more useful. But however you decide to use it, and if you decide to use it, I hope that in some way it helps you and your child to kind of become more aware and, yeah, feel more positive about their autism too. Thank you so much for listening. I know I ran through that quite quickly, but what I want to do is leave as much room for questions as possible. So I will stop now and hopefully we'll go over to some questions.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That is absolutely fantastic. I was sitting there, I did turn my camera off because I find it very distracting when people have their cameras on, but I was sitting there nodding to myself as you were saying all those things. So that's fantastic. And I know we've had a lot of questions. Vicky, my trusty trustee, has been collating them for me. But the chat is so busy that I'm not sure if you've sent me anything, Vicky. So what I'm going to do is at the moment, I'm going to pick the last question that I can see in the chat, and we'll start there. And then maybe Vicky will send me something. Okay, so the term masking implies that my daughter is aware of what she's doing, but I feel that it's an autonomic response and she is unaware of much of her masking behaviours. What does the research say?
It says exactly that. We don't wake up one day when we're 4 years old and go, today I'm going to start masking. I didn't know I masked until I was 23, so I'd gone through my entire adulthood, childhood masking, not realizing what the research is showing is actually moving away. So it used to be called camouflaging, but people felt that meant that people were purposefully doing it, so they called it masking now. But another term used is adaptive morphing, and the idea is the same idea. It's just that it's an instinct and it's an unconscious mechanism and strategy that we use. It's actually a very smart strategy to use, because when you're in a kind of world faced with so much stigma and hostility, it's a way of protecting yourself. So when children do it, they're doing it unconsciously because they're trying to protect themselves from being attacked socially. The problem is, as we get older, it's kind of maladaptive and it causes more problems. But a child is just in that kind of lived moment of protection. So yeah, a lot of people haven't even become aware of masking until the research started talking about it, really. And then they started saying, oh, actually, I've been masking my whole life.
Yeah, absolutely. And this next question is kind of, well, it's very similar, but with a slight twist. My daughter masks because she doesn't want to get in trouble. She doesn't really know how to mask to fit in. Is this still masking? Her self-confidence is low because she can't fit in.
Yeah, I think that's, again, masking is a continuum of loads of different strategies and things. And some people might try and do it and be really good at it. Some people might try and do it and be really terrible at it. Some people might take bits of it, again, all unconsciously. But to want to fit in because you don't want to be in trouble, that's definitely something that I can relate to when I was a child. And that's partly why I was mute, because I just didn't want to say anything or do anything that would get me into trouble, and to bring that attention onto myself. And so you'd learn little things that can be considered masking to do that. So it might be that she doesn't say certain things, or she doesn't like do certain things, or, you know, she's trying to protect herself in different ways. And that's part of her masking experience. It might be that as she gets older that develops, or it might not. But yeah.
Yeah, and we could also say that she was fawning, couldn't we? So a part of the fight, flight, freeze trauma response is that she's you know, she's saying what people want to hear, basically.
Yeah,
and that also happens a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I was helping a young person this week, or last week actually, who's having a terrible time at school, and probably this is a good time to bring up masking at school. And if we're talking about masking to fit in and masking to not get in trouble, and this is why Autistic Girls Network is desperately trying to educate school staff about masking, so that kids aren't getting into trouble for things that they can't mask, shouldn't have to mask, don't want to mask. But unfortunately, it's still happening a lot. And this particular girl is getting into an awful lot of trouble, really, through just because she's overwhelmed. And unfortunately, that happens far too much.
And this is something I've in my book in the section for teachers, is actually avoiding telling autistic children off in front of people, like taking them to one side and not doing it, because part of the masking is that fear, that horrible fear of having that attention brought to you that you've done something wrong. And often we can't help it because we don't realize we're doing something wrong. So yeah, there's quite a lot in there about for teachers and how to go about like helping kids reduce the mask and not needing to, and how they can kind of facilitate that and not worsen the problem.
And what would you say to school staff if, for example, this girl, when she can't manage anymore, she goes and she hides under a table? Now, to us, I'm pretty sure that that's showing really, really distressed behaviour. But what's happening to her is that she's getting negative points.
Not
doing it.
But this is what I mean about challenging behaviours versus problematic behaviours versus coping behaviours. That's not a problem behaviour. She's not hurting anyone. She's not hurting herself. She's coping, and that's what she's learning to do to cope. And it might be that they work on that, and that maybe if she's spending too much time under there, but what they should be looking at is why she's needing to go under that table, not, you know, how to get her out of
and this isn't a young child, this is GCSE year.
Yeah, not
person.
no.
So yeah,
Yeah, no,
there's a lot of
me.
work to be done.
Yeah, that makes me quite angry. Yeah,
I know, me too.
yeah.
So next question, what's the relationship between masking and burnout? Is it a result, is it as a result of exhaustion and trauma?
Yeah, burnout is a kind of something we've known about in autism for quite a while, but research wise is again only just catching up with this idea of burnout. Burnout really is just autistic people when they have too much, when it's overwhelmed. So it's like you've had so many meltdowns, you're shutting down, and it's like a longer term period of exhaustion. It's like a breakdown. If you looked at it as a non-autistic person, you'd call it a breakdown, and they'd spend several weeks, months in this burnout period. And masking and using the resources needed to mask in so many different situations definitely contributes to that that kind of burnout. Yeah, sorry, I can't remember the rest of the last bit of your question.
That's okay. And the increasing incidence of emotionally based school avoidance, or whatever we might like to call it, is very much linked to autistic burnout, I think.
Yeah, I look back now and I think that period I had where I stopped going to school was burnout. I'd burn out, but instead of them realizing that and helping me, it became a bigger thing because I ended up not going back to school at all. Whereas actually that could have just been a few months where they helped me, like, you know, learn strategies and, you know, to calm me down and find ways that I can be more comfortable at school. It wouldn't have needed to end in complete school avoidance.
And that's why the strategy that we see so often is that, you know, you can have a couple of weeks off, but then there's immense pressure to try and get back into school.
Yeah.
And that's just not going to work with somebody who's in burnout, is it?
No, and if nothing's changed, if the reason they're in burnout hasn't changed, that's just going to be a cycle that keeps going round.
Yeah. Okay, so next question. My daughter was diagnosed autistic at age 3. She's since been diagnosed with dyspraxia too. She's 10 now. Every day when she comes home from school, we have what I call the volcano. People say it's due to masking. How can I work out how she's masking?
So sorry, I keep referring to my book. I'm not trying to just purposely sell my book, but it's the only reference I have, is that there is a camouflaging questionnaire that you can actually fill in for your child that might help you understand ways she could be masking that maybe you haven't spotted. But the other way, I guess, with school is to try and like work with the school as much as possible to understand how is she behaving at school, and does that seem different to how she behaves naturally at home. Like if the school are telling you, oh, she's been really quiet all day, she's been chatting to this girl or whatever, and you think, well, actually at home that's not how she is, that kind of be an indicator that she's masking at school in some ways. As I said, I think all autistic people mask to some extent. It might be that she's trying to mask, but it's not going very well, and that's causing problems because, you know, she's coming home frustrated. Yeah, I think the best thing to do is to try and read up more and look at the different ways and try and become more of an advocate for her and what exactly is it that she's doing at home versus at school.
I think really understanding her sensory profile can help too. Unfortunately, it is really so hard to get a sensory OT assessment on the NHS. But if you can, fabulous. I think often when people do get a sensory OT assessment, they find out all kinds of things that they didn't really know, either about themselves or about their child. And it's really, really helpful. But you know, there are ways that you can do it. You can try to find out from school, you know, what was the sensory environment like when something happened, when she went into meltdown. Of course, it could be a combination of like the whole day's sensory experience, but there's probably quite likely to be some kind of sensory input that's going into it, and that's always worth investigating.
Yeah, that's something we've been looking at recently as well, is sensory difficulties in educational settings. And I think that's often missed if you think about masking on top of already being sensory overwhelmed. Like that's quite a big ask, but a lot of people are having to do that. And there's just so many parts of the education institute that are overwhelming just in their own right that a lot of people wouldn't consider.
And of course, it's only one of the reasons why secondary is so much harder than primary, is like that massive input in sensory overload suddenly happens when you move up to a huge secondary school.
And so many more changes. You're changing classes, you're going on classes all the time.
Okay, right. Next question. In your book, is there anything about self-harm? School has been identified as an area of stress, but doesn't have a quiet room.
Self-harm, not so much in my book on, it's not so much on self-harm. I mean, I talk about the mental health consequences, and one of those is self-harm, because when you get really stressed and overwhelmed, it's quite a common mechanism to look at. And I think part of that is, again, working with the school to try and find safe spaces that can reduce that anxiety. So there's less of a need to like regulate that emotion in an unhealthy way, but it is very common. Yeah.
Okay, the next question I think relates to something that you said in your presentation. Why is there no backstage?
There's no backstage because when you're masking as an autistic person, you're always trying to fit in with non-autistic culture in some way. Like it just becomes a thing you're doing all the time. So even if you're doing it at school, it kind of drags in back at home as well, because there's subtle things as well at home. Like even if the child is feeling safe, there's certain things that they're still being taught they shouldn't do, or they don't feel. It's quite rare for an autistic child to have a space that's completely like safe, unless it's like their bedroom or a safe zone. But there's just nowhere where, and it's hard as well. If you've been masking all day, you can't just stop. It's like it's an ingrained unconscious strategy that you don't think 1 minute, okay, I'm going to start now because school started. Oh, school's finished now, so I'm going to stop masking. And then it goes on throughout your life as well. It's not like there's a certain period of your life where you're likely to do it more. Autistic people do it throughout their whole lives because they're constantly still trying to fit in to this culture that they're not as attuned to, or they're not attuned to them either. So I think it's not, there's not a backstage, but there's less likely to be a backstage, and it's harder to find.
Okay, next question. My daughter is 6 and in the latter stages of the assessment process. Her behaviours this school year are so much less apparent and different, in inverted commas, than her first year. Is this masking, or could she not be autistic after all?
I mean, I wouldn't know, but it could be either. It could be that she's got used to the environment as well. It could be that the year before was very stressful because it was newer, and that now she's become a bit more attuned to the environment, is maybe a bit safer. But it could also be that she's masking. It could be that she's learning to hide her traits more. Or it could also be that she's not autistic. But I think, yeah, without knowing exactly how she might be masking, that's quite difficult to say. I think
yeah, we should probably say, shouldn't we, that masking's not automatically bad.
Yeah, yeah.
Some people will always want to mask some aspects.
Yeah. And this thing I put in my book as well, that a lot of autistic people, it's about becoming an advocate for your masking. So a lot of people, I still mask and I still choose to deliberately do it sometimes, and sometimes I do it automatically. Some people find it really helps them get by in life and they don't want to lose that, and that's absolutely fine. It's just about knowing when you and your child are using those behaviors, so you can choose that rather than it becoming a thing that you can't choose and it's stressing you out and, you know, worsening your mental health and stuff.
Okay, so next question. Do you find getting a diagnosis makes any difference? I feel both myself, age 40, and my daughter, age 10, are autistic, but not sure going through the diagnostic pathway will make any difference. My 7-year-old son is diagnosed through the NHS, but schools still do not recognise this, as he also masks in school. Well, school need to recognise it. Can we just say that?
Yeah, they definitely should. I always think there is a benefit in diagnosis, but I say this with a caveat that it's really hard to, I appreciate it's really hard to get those diagnoses and assess them and access them even from different places. But for me, it's about like the validation, and also then that can be useful in other areas. So for example, I didn't have my diagnosis when I was at university, but it'd been really helpful to being able to go to support services and say, I've got autism, what can you do to help with these kind of difficulties I'm having, because I just struggled alone with it. Whereas now my diagnosis means that in different work situations I can get adjustments and I can look at reasonable adjustments. I think it's being realistic though, in terms of getting the diagnosis doesn't mean there's a door that suddenly opens to all this support. That's severely lacking. Post follow-up diagnostic support is terrible in this country anyway. But I do think it can be useful, and I do think it is just useful for yourself to have and to know, and to just again learn more about yourself and to have those kind of the diagnostic process is a long conversation where you learn a lot about yourself, and you might learn some things about your autism or masking or whatever that you didn't think of before.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Please, can you tell us more about masking and autistic burnout?
Okay, add something more than what I said. So masking, as I said, is exhausting. It uses up lots of resources that you could use elsewhere. So often if I've had a day where I'm like masking all day because I've got work meetings, I then can't make dinner, I then can't do things, self-care things. To anyone else, it looked like a depression. But what it is actually is my body has just burnt out of energy. You used all your spoons to kind of deal with that day of having to put on a mask and not be yourself. That causes that burnout. And if you do that every day, or you're building up that over a long period of time, that burnout becomes more of a longer term kind of breakdown. And I think as well, it's a dangerous zone, because if you're not aware of your masking, you're hiding true aspects of yourself, and you're not doing things you enjoy, then your self-esteem is going to take a hit, and all those things as well add to the burnout. Like when you go for a burnout, a lot of it is about depression, not wanting to live, not wanting to like carry on because you don't know how to, because you've lost sense of yourself. And that's how I think masking kind of contributes to that.
I should say, I do hope that we get to everyone's questions, but I've still got 120 new messages I haven't looked at yet, so we might not. So the next one, I'm convinced my 10-year-old daughter is autistic, but the door was slammed shut on her diagnosis through the NHS when she completed the ADOS assessment. But being present at the back of the room, I really felt the assessment was looking for a specific list of traits, perhaps more typically associated with boys, which is a bit of a feature of the ADOS. When I challenged this, I was basically told I had initiated the process too early, started when she was 7 and ADOS done when she was 9. And to see if her mental health declines further and then initiate the process again. What are the other options for getting a diagnosis and the support and recognition she needs? Also, I'm pretty sure I am autistic too. It makes so much sense to me, and honestly, it would be a bit of a relief. So how could I go about seeking a diagnosis for myself as well as my daughter?
Firstly, you can ask for a second opinion. You're entitled to that on the NHS. That's not to say that you wouldn't get someone that also is unaware of how autistic girls present. Research shows that the ADOS is quite biased towards boys. When they've looked at how autistic girls perform on it, they have less social communication difficulties on the ADOS, despite reporting the same kind of difficulties in other ways. So we know the ADOS is biased, and we know screening tools as well are biased. And what's unfortunate is that clinicians think it's okay to let someone's mental health get worse before actually having to re-review that, instead of looking at different ways of reviewing it. So the options would be to initiate a second opinion, or to go private. And private is quite expensive, and it's not something that's accessible to everybody, but it is a valid option if it is something that you can afford or is within your means, to get that ball rolling. There's lots of places that offer those private assessments and they tend to be more clued up about autistic girls, because they have to be, because that's mainly their clientele, is people that can't get a diagnosis through the NHS. So they do tend to be more aware of those kind of things.
And you can complain to PALS, presuming that it wasn't too long ago. You can complain to PALS, and that may help you get a second opinion as well. If you were looking for a private diagnosis, I would advise you to join our closed Facebook group, and you can post anonymously if you want to. Just put in your rough area, don't have to say exactly where you live, put in your rough area and ask for recommendations of clinicians who are good at recognizing autistic girls. And there will be people, there's more than 12,000 people in the group. There will be people in there that have gone to a clinician that's relatively near you. So that would be a good way to go about it. Unfortunately, nationally, ADOS is still by far the most used, despite, I'm sure, most people knowing that it's biased, but that's where we are.
Well, it's based on observations of behaviour, of social behaviours, and if your child's masking it, particularly when they've just met someone for the first time and they're in an unfamiliar environment, their masking is going to be on high alert, their anxiety is going to be on high alert, so they're going to be masking more than usual. It's unfortunate that this is what I mean, where a lot of the research still hasn't caught up with everyday clinicians.
Okay, next question. Is your book for parents only, or would you advise a teenager around 15 could read this herself?
It's actually written for autistic people, so I would say it's more appropriate for the 15-year-old to read it herself. What it does have is a downloadable chapter for parents. So the book itself is for autistic people, adolescents through to adulthood, but it also does offer the opportunity for parents to read it to learn more about their child's behaviours. And then there's some tips in a downloadable chapter that they can then download. So definitely I'd say the 15-year-old it would be appropriate for.
Next question, I assume is from a member of school staff. We are more than happy to support our students by making referrals, but we have a huge wait for neurodevelopmental assessment in our area. The wait is approximately 24 to 36 months at present, and the local authority ASC team will only support students with a diagnosis. This really limits the access to external specialists. Also, if we put in a referral in year 7, they could be at the end of year 9 before they are assessed. We have a super team with loads of experience, and we're able to buy in a small amount of time with an excellent SEN consultant. We have a very popular peer group, parent cafes, sensory room and garden, Lego therapy, forest school, etc. These interventions are all fantastic, but accessed more by the boys than the girls. So what I'm asking is, what would you suggest that could encourage a higher number of girls to access these interventions, or is there another intervention that you would recommend?
I would suggest doing a what I would think might be an issue is if you've got a shy autistic girl that's masking, she might not want to be around quite boisterous boys that are maybe presenting more challenging behaviours. I would consider a girls only group perhaps, or some kind of more like a little art group or something, an art therapy intervention for just girls, or you could do it just girls and boys separately if you want to also provide that for the boys. But just maybe, I guess the issue is with masking, you don't want to look different, and the problem is taking up an intervention like that kind of, you know, says to your peers, I'm different, I'm doing something different. So I think it's about, I guess, making something that's more tuned to that kind of like autistic girl culture. I don't really know what to suggest other than perhaps small groups for all girls to kind of, you know, take part in, and something that's a bit less kind of
and
yeah.
if you can find a special interest that's common, that kind of club is also good, so that you're not singling them out, but you're finding a common interest. So that might work. But
pop music and things often.
Yeah, so Autistic Girls Network now run, we opened our first face-to-face girls group this year, and we deliberately did it for teenagers because of the mental health issues that they face. And I have to say, it is a very vulnerable cohort, I think I would be correct in saying, in that I think there's not one girl in there who hasn't been under CAMHS. There's a lot of eating disorders in it. There's a high amount of anxiety. There's a lot of girls who are on medication, or you know, antidepressants, etc. It's a very different cohort to probably what you're seeing in school, in those groups that are mostly boys. And if you can kind of have that cohort in mind when you're trying to create something, then it might make it easier. Okay, I now have 155 messages that I haven't seen, so I don't think we're going to get everybody's question. Next question. My daughter is 5, just started school and had diagnoses in place before starting. We feel emotionally she needs to understand more about why she feels, thinks and reacts the way she does. She knows something is different. What would you recommend? Would you recommend this at such a young age?
Yeah, I think things like therapy are very good for any age. I think the issue is finding a therapist that understands autism, because often therapies aren't adapted for autistic people. So like I was saying with the CBT stuff, but I think you can get things like play therapy that are quite good for helping children to better learn and understand and read their emotions and things in a way that's not challenging them and trying to change their autism. It's just making them more aware of themselves and their own minds. So I would always strongly advocate for like child play therapy or therapy from quite a young age to kind of, you know, get in touch with those things.
And perhaps this is a good time to say that we would never advocate any kind of ABA therapy.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's just get that out there.
I don't know if it was clear, but throughout my talk, whenever I said treatments for socializing, I was referring to ABA. But yeah.
Okay. If anyone on here doesn't know what ABA is, it's short for Applied Behavioural Analysis. And I'm not going to go into it, but let's just say that we're very against it.
And research shows that it does harm mental health in the long term for autistic people. So it might be that it results in more masking during childhood because they're learning to mask and hide traits. But actually that means that adults are very unhappy with the treatment they received.
Right, so next question. Do you advocate being open with classmates about diagnosis and how this presents? We're talking about a year 5 child here.
It's difficult because on one hand, some children will be very understanding, and on the other hand, you're opening up vulnerabilities. I always say when you're disclosing, to do it to safe people first. So to start with best friends, close friends, and to work your way from there. If you want to go and announce your autism to everyone, that's, you know, perfectly fine. But I think if you're wanting to be cautious and you're just wanting to like test the waters or to like build your confidence in doing it, start with safe people, practice, and then learn how to like what other people might need to know or what other people you'd like to know.
Okay, so next question, and it's a bit of a general question, but let's see what you say. What therapy or counselling works best for autistic girls? I have 2 girls that have been under CAMHS and not engaged at all. School is or has been a real struggle for them.
You know what, it's never about the type of therapy, it's the therapist. And it's not about, studies frequently show that no therapy is better than the other therapy. The thing that makes therapy most useful is the alliance between the therapist and the client. So any therapy where you get a therapist that specializes in autism or is autistic themselves, because there's more autistic therapists now around, is going to be more beneficial. And you can find that when you're looking for therapists online and stuff, they often say what their speciality is. But also you can talk to them beforehand and ask them, you know, you say you specialize in autism, what does that mean? You know, what is your training? What do you think about this? You know, interview them almost. I interview all my therapists to make sure they actually understand what autism is. And just being compassionate in itself. I mean, I've had great therapists before that haven't known a lot about autism, but have just been really compassionate. And so I think it's less about the specifics of the therapy and more about just trying to find that right person that has that fit with your child.
And I mean, we have so many people in the group that have problems with CAMHS, and of course there is no national body for CAMHS, so it's all going to be very much based on whatever is commissioned in your area, what the team is like in your area. CAMHS is or has been and still is horribly underfunded, which means that staff morale is really low. It causes a lot of problems. And when you have something where it says you have 6 weeks of treatment and that's it, and then it stops, then that's never going to be a good thing, because it's going to take those 6 weeks for you or your child to get used to that person. So yeah, there are a lot of problems with CAMHS.
And longer term, as if you look at things like the Maudsley, for example, they offer specialist national therapy, CBT, but they give you 20 sessions, and that makes such a massive difference. But my thing is with autism, it's long-term therapy, like open-ended, tends to work slightly better, because then you set those boundaries when you're ready. Like, as you say, it can take 20 sessions to get to know someone and feel comfortable. Yeah, the model that's currently in place is just not fit. It's not fit for non-autistic people, let alone autistic people.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Is the government mental health support planning on investing more into support tailored to the individual, rather than the onus being on the autistic person or parent to request more tailored support and with someone who understands autism, as it seems to be the one-size-fits-all approach?
I can't really speak of that, but I'm not aware of anything changing that is particularly helpful.
No, neither am I.
No.
Okay, I think we've answered that question, haven't we? Okay, here's a question. Not sure if we'll be able to answer it, but we can try. My daughter said she would be ashamed in school to act out like she does at home, but then she will act out in youth club. Why is this?
She obviously feels safe in youth club. There must be something about youth club that makes her feel safe. Or I guess if it's happening straight after school, maybe she physically can't hold it in any longer. But I would suggest different contexts. You know, I always found that when I went to my brownie group, I was much more like, not challenging, but my behavior definitely changed. I wasn't as shy, and I wasn't as like you know, timid and scared to be told off in that group. I felt safe. It was a smaller group, you knew people, you were doing kind of safe, it's special interest activities. Yeah, so I would suggest maybe she just genuinely feels safer there.
Yeah, I'd agree. Next question. Any recommendations to go into an EHCP to help with masking at school? Lots of mental health issues.
I think, and I've helped some parents, like mostly friends, parents with kids that are autistic, with these, I can't remember what they're called, but I think going in with research or just knowledge yourself, because sometimes the people reading it don't even know it themselves, so you need to tell them, you need to explain like what is masking, why, you know, show them the ways your daughter is masking and how that is manifesting, tell them how it affects them and how it's known to affect people and the risks and stuff. I think you end up becoming your own like psychologist in a way when you're trying to get these things, but the more knowledge you can put onto the paper, the more kind of stuff, you know, they have to read and they learn about as well.
Yeah, and also you need to be having that conversation with the educational psychologist, because only what goes in the professional report is going to end up in your EHCP, sadly. So yeah, make sure that you have a conversation with the educational psychologist or occupational therapist or speech and language if they're involved as well.
Yeah.
Hang on a sec. Does masking create the fawn response in girls where they're more likely to become a people pleaser?
I think we've answered that one 100%. I think that is also why a lot of us end up in mental health services, because we become chronic people pleasers and ignore our own needs in trying to please others.
Yeah, and then when you become a mum, you do it all over again, because that's what mums do. So you're never going to actually be able to please yourself.
And then you end up spending £60 a week for therapy for the rest of your life, because you're trying to do everything you've already done. Yeah. Okay,
next question. Do you think girls can feel happy, supported and safe in mainstream secondary school? My undiagnosed awaiting assessment daughter is in year 7 at an 8-form entry school. Masks in school, busyness in corridors, teachers, numbers, classes, navigation around school, so many new people, all a struggle. She doesn't want to ask for help or solutions via the Senko or to feel different.
I think it's possible. The best year of my life was when I was in year 8 and I was completely oblivious to everything that was, you know, about to happen to me. But I think I just felt safe at that point and understood things. I do think it is about, though, again, your child becoming aware of their triggers and the school creating a safe space where she's not having to mask. The only way to really, I think, be content is if the space is safe. And to do that, I mean, it can be done in a way where she's not being pulled out as being different, but that she's able to access some kind of, like, you know, safe space away from people. It might even be, you know, pretending she's having a music lesson, but actually going to a room where she's allowed to just sit quietly and do her own thing or something, so no one needs to know. But I think it is a massive balancing act of your child. Part of it is not wanting to be different, so that's really hard then to tackle in school when all the interventions make them look different. Certainly why I hid and then just didn't go to school, because I think, yeah, just didn't want to face that kind of difference.
Yeah, and it doesn't really change either. So my daughter's started college this September, and she has full-time one-to-one learning support assistant written into her EHCP, but she doesn't want somebody with her full-time one-to-one. She doesn't want she doesn't want it to appear that obvious. She's fine with telling people that she's autistic, and it's a bit of a balancing act, and college have actually gone too far the other way at the moment, and sometimes she doesn't even know that the learning support assistant is there for her because they don't talk to her in the lesson. So we're kind of having to recalibrate how that works at the moment, and it's more difficult, I think, with schools. Schools don't always welcome having that much parental input into what's going on, so building that relationship and that communication with school and vice versa is really, really important.
Yeah.
Okay, next question, and we're not going to have time for very many more. What do you recommend for undiagnosed girls in a secondary environment who don't want to be seen as different, so won't, for example, use a timeout card or ask for help?
Difficult. Like, I think it's like we just said, really. I think it's maybe working with the school, sitting down and having a meeting where you work out, okay, so what is the need? You need time out. How do we do that in a way that isn't obvious to other people? And maybe that is, like I said, making something up that you're doing music lessons. It's quite normal to leave a class in secondary school to go do music lessons, for example, or to go do something specific that other people are doing as well. It might be about building confidence around her feeling more accepted as an autistic person at school. Like, maybe if you told a few safe people, have some friends that they understood. It's just a balance. It's a massive balancing act between that need to want to be liked and not be different, but also that need to not burn out and be absolutely exhausted. And I think that's all that's going to take is just constant conversations and trying different things and changing different things and working with the school to do that.
Yeah, and it's a very common thing, because often an autistic girl who needs a timeout card is often also situationally mute, and so the actual action of even just putting up your card or saying to the teacher that you need to leave, or standing up when the rest of the class is sat down, can be too much, and that's also the kind of thing that can trigger emotionally based school avoidance. And it's, unfortunately, there's usually, and of course sometimes there is, but often there's not enough knowledge in the school of how to work around that. And in a secondary school it's extra difficult because you've got so many teachers. How can we possibly expect, let's say, 100 different teachers to all know what exactly they should do with these 5 children that have this same problem? It's not really possible for that to happen, is it? And so, yeah, I do think it's very difficult in a very large school.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. And probably we're only going to have maybe 1 or 2 more after this. Any difference in masking for those who also have ADHD?
I also have ADHD, and I have not noticed any different masking to my only autistic friends or anyone I know. I think sometimes it can be harder because of impulse control. So I have noticed growing up that there's been times where my mask has slipped because of my impulse controls being quite poor. Like, I remember a really embarrassing situation at college where I just hysterically kept laughing because I couldn't hide it, and it was just part of my ADHD because I was just very hyper that day. But we're learning now that ADHD looks very similar to autism in terms of the misdiagnosis and the undiagnosis and the masking that goes with it. So not so much is known on that side of ADHD, but my own lived experience tells me that it's very similar.
Yeah, and I would suggest that a huge amount, is that what I'm trying to say? A huge number of girls and women who are diagnosed late are both autistic and ADHD. Yeah. Right, so what's going to be the last question? Is there such a thing as a nationwide mentoring scheme for autistic adults to befriend or mentor autistic children and young people?
No, but that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, there was. Well, it wasn't a national one, but there was one run. But one of the issues with it was that the autistic volunteers had, well, how can I say this nicely? The autistic volunteers were told some really horrific stories, and they had to listen to young people who were really, really traumatized, and it was really traumatizing for them.
Yeah, I can imagine
they didn't get any support with it, and so the scheme finished. It is something that we've looked into, but at the moment we just do not have the funds or capacity to. But I think anything that is set up that you really need, it needs to be addressed, that the autistic mentors themselves also need support.
And I think you can find things like, there's loads of autistic therapists out there now, for example, and I think there's other ways you can find those kind of mentors through other kind of areas. But yeah, I can see that being a massive issue, is the kind of, and safeguarding stuff around that as well.
There's also the Autism in Schools programme, which is now in a lot of areas in England. It's different in each area, but some of them are attempting to set up some kind of autism champion in schools. Now, quite frankly, unless they happen to have a neurodivergent autism champion, then that person might not be autistic or otherwise neurodivergent, but it will be better than nothing.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Thank you so much, Hannah, for giving us all of your time and all of your expertise.
You're welcome.
Do you want to say anything else about your book or where people can get it?
No, it's available in all bookstores, really, Amazon. Yeah, so it's just quite widely available. And if you need to ask anything, or if there's anything you're not sure of, I'm happy if you want to contact me as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how could people contact you?
So I've got a website. So if you go to www.hannahbelcher.com, and that's got my contact details on that.
Okay, brilliant. So we have been recording this, and we will be, at some point when I have a moment, we will be putting it on our YouTube channel, so it will be available for people to rewatch if they wish, or for all of the other people who signed up who couldn't make it tonight to be able to watch. So once again, thank you, Dr. Hannah Belcher, for giving us her time and expertise, and thank you to all of you who came along. Please share what we do. Share what Autistic Girls Network is doing, share what Hannah is doing, and we can help spread the word so that, you know, in 5 years' time, we won't be needing to have a webinar like this. That would be the aim. So
brilliant.
thanks everyone for coming, and have a lovely rest of the night.